my wife's probably telling me she's leaving or something. Not me, but like the
She's
house.
leaving you?
Just the house.
It's already recording. It's perfect.
It's all
My
good.
wife's not leaving me, but if she
The
leaves
house.
the house,
Yeah, there's 3 kids in there that hopefully won't bust the door down. So.
Good morning, everyone. It is Saturday, November 30th. Naraine here checking in from cold Phoenix, Arizona. We were supposed to record this podcast yesterday, but Costin was stuck in rainy Romanian traffic heading back from DEF Camp, which is a conference out there in Romania. Let's start right there, Costin. What is DEF Camp? How was the conference yesterday?
Hi, Ryan. Hi, everyone. DEF Camp is the largest cybersecurity conference in Eastern Europe, and this year it took place in the famous Ceausescu Palace. Nowadays, the Palace of the Parliament, how it's called, but people know it as Ceausescu's Palace, basically. So it's a nice opportunity to visit it. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Steven was there a couple of years ago when you were in Romania. Did you also visit the Palace of the Parliament?
I don't think I got a chance to visit. I saw a lot of beautiful Romanian Bucharest sites, but not the palace. I don't think.
All right, let's do the formal introduction. As our credibility wanes, we've reached out for some celebrity stars to check in on the podcast and raise our listener count. Steven Adair is founder of Volexity. You guys are in the news this week, having done your presentation at CyberWarCon last week. We should apologize that we actually discussed your entire presentation without even looking at it or reading the paper. We were going by Andy Greenberg's story and we kind of went along with it. So we brought you on the show to kind of dig into the details a little bit. Welcome to the podcast. How are you, my friend?
Oh, thanks. I'm doing great. It's all good because his article was well written and your discussion, I listened to it. I think it was pretty on point. It sounded good to me. So yeah, thanks for having me though.
Thanks for popping on. Juanito, how are you? You're checking in back from Washington, D.C. You went out to CyberWarCon, but you missed his talk. How are things down there?
I only got the second half of the talk because we were recording the podcast, just trying to get the scoop on our Volexity friends. But I'm good, man. It's getting fucking cold, and I don't seem to handle it as well as I used to. So I'm here like looking like a geriatric with like a blanket. I've got gloves around. It's all...
All right, let's jump right into it. But for the first, let's go back from the beginning for 5 people who has never heard of Volexity. What do you guys do?
So yeah, Volexity, we do a few different things. We're kind of a product and a services company. So like products as software. So we develop software for acquiring and analyzing system memory. So like RAM from a system. And we do that cross-platform. So Linux, Mac, Windows. So if you want to make sure you're getting volatile data, stuff that's only in memory, we have kind of products to acquire that, surge, and analyze it called Volcano. And then kind of that tooling also, surge specifically, it's not solely memory. You can acquire, potentially depending on the OS, full disk, and kind of other selective like disk artifacts, right? You want some live response data, you want on a Windows system, the MFT, registry, hives, USN journal, helps you kind of acquire that stuff and do it all potentially in one shot or multiple kind of, collections, depending on, your setup. Excuse me, do have a cold. On the services side, we kind of do everything from, we kind of start off network security monitoring. It's a big part. We really believe in network visibility and telemetry, but we do MDR services. We monitor our customers' EDRs. We monitor their kind of productivity suites, like their Google Workspace or Microsoft 365. But we do alongside that or separate from it or along, maybe leading to it, but incident response forensics. And obviously our tooling, not required, but it often plays a big role in how we do that, acquiring system memory, digging in deeper to the system. But like any good firm that does incident response, it's whatever telemetry gets us to the answer, whether that's a log file, interviewing a person, or whatever the case may be. And then our team, we have a big threat intelligence team at this point that we're growing continuously. That kind of helps us run down different threats, but also kind of some of the research on our things we inform, either helps kind of tie the picture together, or they're the ones that found it all together, depending on what it is on our company. So that's probably us in a quick nutshell.
I gotta take a minute to kind of gush about the company. I'm a huge fan, and just to be clear, right? Like this is not like a sponsored video or anything like that, but like just a huge fan of the company. One thing that I always admired was, first off, I think everybody's kind of shied away from handling memory properly. Like that seems to be one of those harder tech problems in our space that, you go, yeah, all the answers are in memory. Yes, you could be getting a lot more intel. it's hard. So they just like everybody kind of skips it and sort of sets aside. And something that I thought was really interesting about how you guys seem to set off to start Volexity was actually picking up the folks from like the main devs from the Volatility project. So it was kind of like you almost kind of corralled the technical expertise for the memory space. So for folks that, I mean, whoever's under a rock, right? If you've never done memory analysis, like the Volatility project is like the open source framework for analyzing memory and has been for like 10 years or something like that. And like, I think Michael Lee, Andrew Case, God, remind me of her name. I'm missing one last person, like the folks that wrote the Art of Memory Forensics book.
So Aaron Walters, and then you're probably thinking of Glida or Jamie.
Yes. I mean, you guys seem to pick up all of them, right?
Well, Jamie's at Huntress. That's where she is now. But she, close friend, obviously big friend of the family. They all work together closely, and just saw her recently at our FTS Con last month.
So you know, it shouldn't be the Volexity podcast, but I am kind of fascinated by that approach, right? Like that you would take on this really difficult area and actually grab the folks that clearly were doing it already, that knew what was going on, and just ride it. Like, how long have you guys been at this? 10 years?
Yeah, so Volexity's, we're approaching, right at, I guess, 11 years. We've kind of been growing, like, slowly. Well, some days, some weeks or years faster. But, you know, as we kind of brought on more people, brought on more customers, and kind of, you know, use that as our metric to grow and hire and make sure we're making the right decisions from our point of view. Yeah, but memory, obviously, yeah. So, like, the services side, you know, we end up using a lot of our own tools, obviously, where we can. But on the product side, you know, that was a kind of fundamentally being able to acquire and analyze memory, do it right, do it at scale. That's a big part of the company, right? So like the grad school research of the team, the work that we've done, the volatility, what they've learned from running and continue to learn from running the, you know, volatility, the volatility foundation, the project there. We always wanted to kind of have some commercial options that, you know, basically extended or learned from the problems that people were running into. How do I acquire memory without crashing a system? Like you said, it's very difficult. We have an entire team that basically tracks, you know, changes to the operating system, kernel releases across platform, make sure it's not just collecting and not crashing. You don't want all zero. So if I collect a bunch of memory and I have nothing to analyze, or I skipped a whole bunch of like useful memory space, that makes the memory sample and crash a system. But like, what am I going to learn from that? Obviously, if you crash a system, that's kind of like the worst case scenario from like a product doing that. And you know, we have a really good track record on that. And that's a big focus. There's a lot of testing, a lot of updating, understanding fundamentally what the changes to the OS are and what the risks are to stability. But that's a huge part of the company and what they're constantly tracking. And like, it's kind of people who use the tool, you don't see all the work, you know, that goes behind the scenes to do that. But like you said, it is a tough problem to tackle, and it's one that we actively take on. Obviously, there's things in tooling that go after process memory. There's, you know, other things out there that do acquire memory. It's not the depending on the specific OS or versions, there are other options. But in terms of consistent speed, the flexibility, the features, and number of OSs to go after, I mean, yeah, it's a big undertaking, and it's one that they embrace and do extremely well, best in the world, from my opinion. But yeah.
Costin, shouldn't your EDR software be doing what Volexity does? In my mind, the success of your company, Steven, is driven by the fact that EDR software is missing a lot of things, and you have to come in at this backup at this last stage. And we've talked about this, and we've spoken about this on this podcast about the absence of tools for network telemetry, for this kind of inspectability. You mentioned in your description of the company that you guys do that. Like, why shouldn't organizations rely on their EDR vendor to provide this? Why do I have to go get memory forensics expertise somewhere else?
So if you ask me, I think it's a better question to Steven directly. But there was one thing which attracted my attention in the blog, by the way, that you guys actually spotted the attack because a rule that you wrote for files being created, written to program data, triggered on that machine. So I guess that's typically, you know, EDR territory, not necessarily memory dumping. So one of the questions I wanted to ask, if you guys have an EDR agent, or how did you write that rule specifically?
And was the victim running EDR, and you have to come in on the background after the EDR missed this thing?
No, so a couple of things. Yeah, I mean, you're making that kind of a loaded question there, right? So let me, just to be clear, we're, like I kind of said earlier on, whatever gets us to the right visibility, network, EDR, after forensics we do proactive analysis of systems, but usually, especially in an IR, there's a reason you're going there, right? So the EDR tripped something, the network tripped something, a weird log happened. So I'll answer the first. Let me start with the first part of it is the EDR. I mean, the memory analysis comes in when you want a complete deep dive on that system. It could be something that EDR missed. It might not be something it missed. It could be something the analysts missed. EDR caught it, said it's bad, and they kind of understand the context or get more of what it was doing, or this suspicious binary ran, but now I went and saw an unpacked version of it got loaded in the memory, and I found out that it was this backdoor that, even static analysis on the disk couldn't pick up. It's not like this is we don't think of it strictly as because EDR failed. There's a lot of stuff living off the land, behaviors, other things you want to figure out what an attacker did that might not have been logged or completely logged, or maybe it was logged properly, but you have a way to find it in memory. So it's kind of, it is something has happened once you pull in, memory analysis, but you could be proactive, could be reactive. In the case, like Costin, like you were saying, the initial detection was on an EDR front, but it wasn't that EDR. It wasn't an in-house signature. The EDR didn't say, oh, hey, this is bad. And it was a signature. As I say, I struggle to say signature because of the way that EDR is set up, it can't save signatures. We could run queries. So we had scheduled queries, which basically ran, which, like, for example, in some of the EDR now, that would be something you could save and have running automatically. I don't know if that's changed, but at the time, that was something we just had to schedule through the API. So it was a query through the EDR that we did. We wouldn't have had that visibility or ever known that had happened until maybe the attacker did something else like further up or later on. But yeah, it was an EDR query that we kind of developed and ran. It came in. And obviously, it's kind of some of the memes I've seen on X, Twitter, Blue Sky, kind of like, hey, really advanced threat actor does all this really cool stuff, runs a bat file from the root of program data. It's kind of like, you look at that and you're like, that's a really obvious, for a lot of incident responders that people do, threat intel or response to this type of threat. You're like, yeah, that's kind of amateur, or that's like kind of not the most advanced thing to do, or it's a little bit obvious, but depending on where you are, that will just go completely unnoticed. Or someone will look at it and be like, oh, I don't know. The EDR said it's bad. I don't know. But yeah, it was EDR that ultimately was kind of what kicked this off and a query through it.
And Juan, that's because EDR is this part of the work is hard, like you just described, right?
It depends, right? Like there's honestly, there's things that EDRs are doing extremely well that work on more of this continuous monitoring basis. And there's things that I think EDRs are particularly failing at capitalizing that happen to be what folks doing memory analysis and doing firmware analysis do very well, right? Like the EDRs and to some extent sort of the old school AVs that have survived and continue to manage. One thing they did very well was get on sort of the behavioral side of things, right? And think about it as like the system is running all the time. We want to be able to monitor things all the time without disrupting the system, without, obviously, as Steve said, without crashing it, but then also being lightweight enough, which was sort of the issue with old school AVs, right? Like people hated old school antiviruses because you're like, oh, this thing is sort of pegging one of the CPU cores at like 95% all day, and I hate it. So there's this sort of like balance of like subtle balance of how do we use as little resources as possible while still monitoring this thing all the time, while still doing more than just this sort of like shitty logging of whatever like basic metadata is. So hopefully you have a behavioral engine which is kind of telling you that things are going awry or things are happening sort of in memory or during execution dynamically that you might want to look into. But it's not the same as doing that thorough deep dive. It's not the same as having like a full memory capture. So I think in many ways, the same as we may not be like EDRs are not a full on IR tool as much as, it's the canary in the coal mine in a lot of ways. It's the inventory in a lot of ways. It's the baselining of what's normal and not normal. And then at the end of the day, when something kicks off, when something goes wrong, when something looks weird, you're still going to call Mandiant, you're still going to call Volexity, you're still going to need to have somebody who goes, hey, okay, let's collect everything and try to put this picture back together. So it's different pieces for different parts of it. And, no, it's not perfect. It's far from perfect, but you do have different trade-offs. Right?
Just to close the loop on the business side of this conversation, Steven, when you're talking to buyers, you're positioning yourself as additive to their security program, or you're replacing something within their security program? What is that conversation like?
I mean, it could be both. I mean, it's definitely additive or kind of maturing the stack in some ways. Like, hey, this is a capability you didn't have before. How are you acquiring this? How are you making sure you have a total trusted look at a system? Like, I want to your system's running malware, and tools could be saying that it's okay. I want to acquire things at a higher level, and I want to kind of deep dive it. So it's like an investigative tool that, it does require a bit of maturity in some organizations. Not to say like, hey, if you're not doing it, you're not mature in your response process, but like some places that just don't do this at all, and they need some kind of level of understanding. And part of what we do is try to make some of that like more bite size. It's not necessarily dumbing it down, but it makes things easier, makes things repeatable, makes things that the teams can work on. But obviously, the more someone goes and understands like using volatility and what memory analysis and how things hide and how rootkits work, that'll just empower you to use like this tooling like better. But yeah, we usually see it as more of a maturing type capability for incident response teams, for investigative teams, for teams that want to do proactive assessments. I mean, you could do it to say, hey, you could look into things like stability on a system, but I mean, it's largely like law enforcement, incident response teams, investigative teams that are kind of adding this to their stack if they don't have it already, or they've traditionally been using. Maybe they're doing some level of memory analysis, but they're using volatility, and they kind of want to have a step up in, like you said, to turn it sponsored podcast or anything, but they want to turn it into like a more enterprise, like collaborative type capability. So that's where we usually see it, is like either improving or adding a capability for the most part.
Backing away from the potential of a sponsored podcast, and maybe this is still like feeding into the narrative. It's like, do you have any competition?
Good question.
Like, cause, I mean that honestly. Like, if I sat here and I was like, I want memory and like remote memory analysis, but
Isn't
I
that what
don't
Matt
like.
Swish was building?
Yeah,
But
so
that got bought by Magnet, right?
Right.
Yeah, so there's different tools out there. There's other capabilities. Some that are paid and do certain capabilities. Some are free. But in terms of like and there's other people that are doing open source projects and other things that they're doing good work. And obviously, probably one of the biggest competitors is just Volatility, right? A free Python framework. Volatility 3 is actively under development. It's kind of has more parity with the previous versions now, which is something people were really looking for. There are other options out there, whether it's free or paid in some capacities. But in terms of like like you said, but I kind of go back to what I said before. You want a dedicated team that's actually actively tracking the kernel updates, doing this. Sometimes ahead of the release, sometimes shortly after, and it's a lot of work. So I mean, it's just to compete in a meaningful way. I think it takes a lot of expertise, a lot of time, and a lot of patience. And we have that right now. So I just think we're doing that really well. So I mean, that's probably the hardest part of it. Not to say there aren't other smart people at your guys' companies and in other places, but it's been a focus, and it's also like a passion for the team, right? So you have to really want to do it, and that's where we just have a really good cross section of all of that, basically. So,
Costin, you got a question on this?
I was thinking actually two things. One of them was that in many cases when I was trying to dump the memory from systems that I was asked to investigate, in many cases the systems crashed. I was using Mandiant tool once, like dumping the memory. Sometimes it can be a risky maneuver, if you want. And the other thing was something I read in the blog, and maybe you can share more information about. You're saying that when you guys tried to dump the memory of one of the servers, it shut down. Was it because it crashed, or was it someone shut it down?
Yeah. So the crashing problem is, it's not to say our tool is never crashing, but we run it all the time. We have customers run it all the time, and it's deployed widely. Any type of report of that is top priority for the team to dig into. And sometimes certain cases and weird things that can cause instability. And that's gonna be a natural risk of like loads kernel drivers and things. And you can go back to like, hey, from the CrowdStrike activity, and people are like, oh, we should get out of the kernel and other things. And that can be a case for it. But then also, you want to give an attacker carte blanche access to, if they can load or find an exploit or find a way to do it, now they're invisible to you. So the risk is always there. We think that the juice is worth the squeeze majorly on our side. To ask you a specific question, which is kind of, if you watch the presentation at some point, if it gets online, you probably see the frustration and some of the things we described that we would rather happen than this. That happened because of we'd been in contact with the customer of the system. The customer shut it down. So it'd been, in fact, I would say in a lot of cases, I don't remember the exact amount of time, because like this is now 2.5 years ago, that specific case. And we might have it written in there somewhere, but it had been collecting memory for quite some time. And it turns out like that system, I'd say a lot of our customers, we have customers that hey, they have a petabyte of memory in their system, but usually 1632 gigs of RAM. And this one had hundreds of gigs of RAM, like 256 or something. So what would normally be done in like 4 minutes or something, it was like going on. And, it's, hey, this thing might be done any minute now. We didn't realize how much memory it had just kicked off the collection. I mean, it doesn't matter, right? But like in terms of, so to see it shut down, in most collections, it probably would have finished already, but this thing had a lot of memory and it was just chugging along. So yeah, it was not an. They said it was like one of the worst feelings when you're like in the middle of like a key system. This was our first system. This was the first thing that triggered. This was the very number one lead we had in this case, and that machine is the one that got shut down. That's the one where they used the Prince Spooler privilege escalation exploit. We didn't know it at the time. I don't know that if that memory collection had fully succeeded, if we necessarily would have recovered or would have been things loaded in memory, they did clean up after themselves, the attacker. But yeah, better chances of it. But yeah, we'll never know. So,
are we talking about a solitary victim, or do you know that there were multiple victims? Like,
well, we know of 3 victims, you guys are aware, because we have a Org A, our customer, and B and C, which were kind of adjacent or nearby. But this probably isn't the first time it happened, probably not the last time. It's just the only one that we're aware of, right? So,
and I ask because what do you what should a company do to spot any signs of this? Like, what can organizations in, let's say you're Washington, D.C., you're a Ukrainian think tank, and you think, okay, I'm definitely a target for these guys. What should I be setting up now as a trap to find this thing?
Yeah, like I say, a lot of this does come back to a lot of the, paying attention very closely. Deploying EDR is like a really big one, right? Having that deployed to every and all systems that it can go on. But then this is also why we're a big fan of network telemetry. Is EDR may or may not pick up everything. That may not even be a problem, right? They're living off the land, but EDR isn't necessarily on all systems, right? We have a lot of these edge devices that are getting popped. They can't run EDR, and having the visibility of suddenly your firewall is connecting inbound or it's doing other things. So I think the odds of noticing, if you get really locked down in your setup, and probably this is more than the convenience factor and the ability to lock things down and really notice. If your environment's really locked down, yeah, maybe you could notice someone getting on your Wi-Fi. That's a little bit abnormal. I think that's extremely unlikely, even in the wake of like saying, hey, this is actually happening. Or other cases where someone broke in to notice just generically that there's an unauthorized party doing things on Wi-Fi. I think it really comes down to, like this case, having some kind of signal or that canary, and then paying really close attention to it and working backwards. So I don't necessarily think you're going to pick someone up just because they got on your Wi-Fi. You're going to pick up something else that is odd or shouldn't be happening, and you got to take the time to work back and figure out like how it happened. So I think that just goes back to security monitoring for any type of incident of any kind to like a generic degree.
On that same note, right, you guys have been doing amazing work sort of figuring out these firewall appliance led incidents, right? It's been amazing, right? Like, you guys have been finding great stuff. And I think this is one of the areas where, like, Ryan keeps asking about sort of, EDR sucking. And the first place that I will mention, that most of the EDR seem to be failing quite tragically, as you would expect, is sort of this network appliance side of things, right? Like, there's really no way that an EDR or XDR, whatever you want to call it, by itself is going to figure out this is going on, except for like follow-on actions. So, I really admire the work you guys are doing, and you've got some great folks, good friends of ours, Paul Raskagneris, Tom Lancaster, like, we're just amazing TI folks. But then I'm also super curious when I see sort of these Volexity posts about like, hey, this Sophos appliance got hit, this Palo Alto appliance got hit, this Ivanti appliance got hit, and then we see X, Y, and Z going on. I'm always like, how the fuck did these guys catch that, right? Like,
I'm listening to this podcast. Steven, I don't know if you listen to this show. We got like 30-something people listen. Probably you don't. But when I listen to this show, all I hear from Costin and Juan is that nobody can monitor these things. They're dark spots. They're an empty spot. There's no network telemetry. There's nothing coming out of these things. And then when I go to Volexity's blog, I see in the last year, Palo Alto, 0-day in the wild exploitation. Ivanti O-days, Drifting Cloud, Sophos Firewall O-day, Active Zimbra O-day exploitation, Fortinet VPN 0-day explained. Like, you guys are right in the hub of watching this thing, so it does exist. How are you finding these things when no one else, when all these guys say it's unfindable?
Yeah, I don't think they're saying it's unfindable. They're saying it's a tough point would be my guess. But yes, I admit 31 listeners to the podcast, as you know. So yeah, add one more that you forgot about me. a couple of things. One, as you mentioned, Paul, Tom, our threat intel team, they're awesome guys, and they may not necessarily be on the incident response or the network security monitoring teams. Sometimes maybe they do, maybe they are a little bit. But like the work they do or some of the signatures that they write or other things that they come into play for kind of like for us, a holistic approach in terms, that's where a lot of the network security monitoring for us comes into play. So
what percentage of that is skill? You think skill accounts for what? 20% of everything you're doing?
Define everything we're doing, like in terms of detecting something, the company
No,
at large, or
around this conversation around monitoring and detecting, how much of it is because you have just good guys who know how to look?
I think that's I don't know your percentage, but you're 80+%, right? So because it's not just having telemetry, it's like knowing what it means, it's knowing what to do next. I mean, I think that's what makes good like incident response and monitoring. It's like a bit of things you can train, a bit of instinct, and then back to interest and passion, right? Like do you sit there, do you lay awake at night thinking like, how the hell did they do that? Versus like, it's 5 o'clock, I'm clocking out and I don't care anymore. And then you go back the next day and you provided no extra thought on it. I think that's kind of a big part of what sets a lot of the better researchers, response team, the companies apart. But for the conversation around, like, I'll take the Palo Alto 0 day on the firewall, Global Protect firewalls from April. That was caught from network security monitoring at a customer. And the reason that was caught, and so if we can say, I mean, we post about it as much in our blog, but that's essentially network security monitoring, but in a few things like to flag, but specifically the attacker like downloaded a Python file that created a reverse shell. And that's something we carved out of the traffic. That's something we had a signature that was years old written by our threat intel team that basically it carved out the file, it scanned it on our sensor and said, hey, this is a reverse shell. And they did a couple other things that tripped some other network signatures, and ultimately one Microsoft Defender for identity signature later triggered. But that was from a network security visibility. Now you could say, hey, the attacker, they just used SSL or TLS. Almost all those signatures that flag would have gone nowhere. So major fail on their part. Also, everything they did on that reverse shell, we were able to pull from PCAP and literally watch everything they did. So we had a really good accounting of when it started, what they did, how they did it. And then, that kind of spoiled that for them. But a similar story on some of the other things. They mess up somewhere along the stack and we have network visibility. But network visibility as a detection mechanism has been really big for us. But also, it's not always just detection, right? We can flag something on an EDR, then we look on the network and we work it back. And we may or may not be able to get that from event logs or a firewall log or an EDR telemetry. EDR may have that it moved here and we can walk it back. But like a few seconds, minutes, we can say, hey, this RDP came from this system. What the hell is that system? That was a VPN node. Okay, who was connecting to the VPN at that? And we may need to pull logs from the other sources to do this, but we can walk back really quickly. Then we can say, hey, what was that firewall, that VPN node doing? And that's where we say, oh yeah, it was doing curl requests to check its IP on, February X or, December, whatever. It's connecting internally SSH. And you're investigating that from your past telemetry. But those can also become like future signatures, right? Hey, these devices should only be connecting to the LDAP server, the Duo gateway on the internet, and its update server. So if it does anything outside of those three things, or if it starts doing SSH, SMB, RDP, RPC, WinRM, all these other things, I'm going to alert on that. We have some lessons learned, and you can't, this is a little bit easier for people who have dedicated security staff, right? We try to do that with a lot of our customers, but trying to know every single individual appliance, not every appliance necessarily always has a separate IP for its management versus all the other things that it does, which can make it really painful. If all the VPN users' web traffic and the VPN device's IP are the same, it's kind of a non-starter to really find something that's anomalous in that. But our visibility has let us pick up a lot of this. That last Sophos 0 day we picked up, or one of the last things we worked on Sophos, we learned that customer had been hit before. We just wrote rules to basically, this firewall does anything that it shouldn't, let me know about it. And just one day we had an inbound connectivity, and we said that it took us all of 2 minutes to go in and say this firewall is owned. Now, obviously, we have a bit of an investigation from there, but that's what we've been largely doing around those devices, just having really good visibility or telemetry. And I'd say even in this case, like the Palo Alto one that initially triggered, I mentioned we had there's a Microsoft Defender for identity, which is kind of not their EDR. It's not the Defender for endpoint, but it's kind of like an add-on where the domain controller or Active Directory looks for anomalous events and things that are going on. It's probably, maybe Microsoft wouldn't love that description, but roughly, it's
a paid product. It's a paid enterprise product that they sell on top.
It's kind of like an add-on on top of the EDR that kind of around like the identity of what users do authentication. I might even see a computer name looks like something Metasploit would generate or something like that. Like that's trying an authentication. But it flagged on that, and the account it was using was associated with the firewall. So if all of our other networks, telemetry had failed, we would have saw this Defender for Identity alert and been like, well, where did that come from? That IP is the firewall. It's using the firewall account. We would have gotten there at some point, most likely. So, I mean, it's kind of really following that signal and not ignoring it. And that's been the case for a lot of different devices and other things we've seen over the years, and not just the ones we have blogs on. So.
You need to be a sophisticated organization, have a sophisticated security program with a lot of things plugged in and monitoring to be able to do detection and incident response at this level. It feels like this is a haves and the have-nots conversation where, this is only available for a handful of companies that, one, can afford it, and money and resources-wise.
And to an extent, right? I mean, the biggest toys, the biggest things, they might always have a cost associated with them. But even if I'm on a shoestring budget, I mean, that's where the knowledge and like the dedication comes in, right? Even in a small environment that doesn't have a lot of security budget, like setting up a log server, locking things down, having the firewall, making lateral movement, having VLANs restricted, isolating devices, property. I mean, you can do these things where most of the actual measures and steps have no specific cost or vendor associated with it. I mean, you can stand up your own server to do, packet logging and, PCAP capture and IDS with like Suricata or something like that. I mean, but it goes back into the knowledge, the dedication.
But nobody's doing it. I mean, the reality is...
I mean, I know there's a lot of people out there that work real hard and defend their network. There's a lot of network defenders out there, and like that I think are probably doing a great job. But maybe their network may just not get these attacks. I mean, that could also be the thing. So they're doing it. If it happened, they would be on it, or you just don't hear about it, right? So even this story, if our customer didn't let us talk about it, you would never hear about it. So
what was that conversation like, convincing them that you should go public with this? Was it because it was kind of politically themed? I mean,
the answer, the kind of like the discussion. I mean, discussion. We have really good relationships with a lot of our customers, which I think is part of the why our success on a lot of things works well. We're really ingrained. Sometimes we even know who the employees are. Not that we like work with them on a daily basis, use IT or security function at these places, but the conversation wasn't too difficult. It's not one you want to have during the IR. When this is done, can we talk about this? Like, right, you look like ambulance chaser, and it's not the first thought you have anyway, right? Oh, I need to tell everyone about this, right? We're trying to focus on solving a problem. And then the further you get removed from it, it's just knowing your customer and what's a right ask or not, right? Like you can everything. You don't talk about everything you work on. You don't even ask, but it's kind of just knowing the customer well and having the conversation with them. So this one went pretty easy with the customer. It just took a little bit of time or getting kind of more removed from it for it to be more appropriate, I'd say. So.
One of the things we speculated last week when we were discussing it ahead of time was that there had to be someone boots on the ground, someone in proximity trying, and we referenced the Russians being caught in Europe with the car trunk open with all this Wi-Fi equipment and so on. They might have been boots on the ground. In the presentation, that was not the case, apparently. Can you explain a little bit about how you believe they were able to figure out this kind of proximity, nearest neighbor across the street thing? You think they used Google Street View? Like what? How do you speculate the boots on the ground piece was handled?
Yeah, to be completely honest, I mean, we kind of tell a story of like how it could have happened, and even in the presentation, we have a really cool infographic that Crystal from our team helped us develop with Sean and I. We built out this infographic of like an attacker's in Russia. They want to attack this customer, but they can't get in, so they find organizations nearby and they break into them. We don't know the actual workflow, obviously. They could have broken into those organizations, just started looking around and said, oh, that's someone I'm interested in, and then concocted this plan. The actual, like, how did we go from nothing to a target to these buildings? We don't know the exact order of operations. And it theoretically could have had someone boots on the ground. I can't remember the website, but I know Sean from our site, Sean Kessler, works with me on this. He's talking about one of these websites where you can go on it and you can it lets you search different SSIDs and where they are on a map because people have gone around and done that. So theoretically, you can do some of this like searching where things are physically overlaid on a map, SSIDs and everything from like a public website. That theoretically could be involved. But I mean, from our perspective, if I had to guess, it would be like breaking into multiple different organizations, realizing what they had, and then taking advantage of it. But I mean, it literally could be, hey, there's like, I'm going to go on Google Maps, Street View, or zero in and see which search addresses I mean, just target those organization, completely plausible. Similarly, it's not like I just don't know how to give this any like a percentage weight, but it's not improbable or impossible that there was at some point someone driving around and they decided they were like, oh, I can get on this Wi-Fi, but it's too risky for me to do this in the middle of Washington D.C. and kind of do this like regularly. They kind of pivoted to getting to a nearby organization. We just don't know the order of operations. I mean, but it's not impossible, or I don't even say improbable, that at some point in time that there was someone driving around or nearby.
One of the things we've learned from history, I don't know why these guys don't have, these guys were supposed to have a list of questions, but they leave me in a lurch here. One of the things we learned from listening to these APT reports and these presentations is that usually it's 1 year old data. We're talking about, historical things that have happened. In this case, you mentioned it occurred just ahead of the Ukrainian invasion, which was, years ago. Has there been any update, any fresh new development in this? Has it been cleaned? Like, what can you update the audience with that's, more?
Yes, I mean, it's nothing. There's really nothing else outside of it other than what besides the in the weed details. You have to distill what was like hours or days or weeks of stuff into like a short form blog or a 30 or 45 minute, however long I ran over a presentation at CyberWarCon. The main thing is booted out from the enterprise network that we saw initially. That was probably back in March, and then I don't know, it was a month and a half later. Attacker actually came back. Say gruesome large APT28 attacker. Them came back and actually got on the guest Wi-Fi at this organization, which was kind of notable and a surprise to us. Maybe it shouldn't have been. That kind of used a static password that hadn't changed in probably years. So like a kind of like a much softer target, but the kind of fun thing or clever thing for them is they managed to find literally one system that straddled the two networks, got into it with credentials that hadn't been changed. So the remediation in terms of having every single T cross and I dotted wasn't fully there. I mean, it's kind of hard, but we do tell people a lot of times, hey, you have 26 steps. If you do 25 out of 26, you're risking that all 25 potentially were wasted. That's like a nature of like a proper full remediation. But they found this one system which straddled the two networks and was able to pivot internally, forwarded. At that point, our telemetry had been like set up so much that it was a very quick investigation to figure this out. It was a bit of a surprise, but that got cut off like really quickly. So effectively mounted to not a lot happening. But since that, and I want to believe that I think we said that was May. And I had to go back to when we wrote the blog. I had to go back to like our own incident reports and notes to remember the dates on things. I'm a little bit removed from writing or working on the blog a little over a week ago at this point. But yeah, we hadn't seen them since then that we're aware of. And that was that, a lot of stuff changed. I mean, I don't want to go into exact details of the measures they took on their specific Wi-Fi because I don't think it's impossible or improbable that those involved in that attack or may want to follow up or know exactly what organization we're talking about. Would listen to this or see the blog. So we don't want to go into this.
Nobody listens to this.
But it's, I just saw a 30-second person just got on. It might be. So.
Was there anything legal stopped you from saying?
No, I mean, there was no legal. I mean, there's things that in terms of like confidentialities that we said it, we'd probably be in immediate trouble, or the customer wants to cancel and not work with us. But yeah, so I mean, we're careful. I mean, like the stuff we're talking about is like technical specifics, and there's not like I don't even know. Yeah, short of saying like the organization's name or a few other details, like I don't think there's
everything is out there. Costin, any unanswered questions on your part?
There were like a couple of them that I was. I didn't write them in the document, but I definitely have them in my head. So one of them was, I was wondering, how did they know that the Wi-Fi didn't require? They abused the network, the internet-facing service to brute force the username passwords, and somehow they knew those would actually give them access to the Wi-Fi. So I was wondering, like, how do you guys have a theory? How did they know the Wi-Fi wouldn't have MFA as opposed to other things?
Yeah, to be honest, I have no idea. I mean, it could have been a trial and error. I don't think we have like a full like auth log of saying like, hey, did they test this or do that? It may have just been first try, it worked. I would say from our experience, to be completely honest, a lot of the enterprise I can't say I know or have authenticated using an Active Directory credential on most organizations or customers' enterprise Wi-Fi's, but I would say from the ones I can remember, from what I know, it would be relatively uncommon for a certificate and or even any form of like multi-factor to be involved at that point. In fact, I'd say most of our enterprise Wi-Fi's, they're like just still like our enterprise like corporate or just some kind of like password that everybody knows. I mean, that's something we look at in assessments and audits. But yeah, it's known to employees, but not guests. They have a separate guest network, but then employee leaves, password's still the same a lot of the time, and that's always like a risk. But yeah, I don't know for sure on that, but no specific theories other than they just tried it.
And I think obviously the this organization was somehow interesting, and we've seen like many times in the past that having a kind of valuable magnet of threats can bring you a lot of interesting stories. Like how important is this thing for you guys? Having, let's say, the right kind of customers that they're just magnets to all sorts of things, sophisticated attacks.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, like I know that it was like what is that? That one system that had like 5 different countries, like threat actors on it. Yeah, we have a good number of customers that are interesting for numerous reasons, whether it's defense contractors, technology companies, crypto companies, the NGOs, the think tanks, the political people in political space, or their international aid development. We have some that they upset or otherwise do things counter to what the governments or oppressive, a lot of times oppressive regimes, not always, do in like one region. And we have some that do that in like, I need 2 hands to count the number of regions that they fall in that radar. So we do have a good number of customers that are targeted by a lot of different threat actors for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes it's their work, sometimes it's their people, sometimes it's their mission or the financial type of stuff they have access to. So I that definitely plays a big role in like our detecting this, right? Like if all of our customers were just auto body shops and we have customers of all walks of life and businesses, but if they were all just that, yeah, we'd probably see a lot less. We'd see much more just strictly financial, opportunistic, BEC, other criminal activity, ransomware. That we'd see like primarily or only that. We see that even at the highly targeted customers, right? They get the BEC scams, they get ransomware attempts, they get hit with commodity crypto miners going after anything. But yeah, we do have a really good confluence of customers that are super highly targeted, and a lot of them turn to us because we work really hard to defend them. Or once you start getting that base, you see a lot of threats, and you're more valuable or like a particular value to those organizations that are seeing the asynchronous threat actor. They are a lot more well resourced than they are. And we also even work with like individuals, human rights organizations, human rights like people who fight pro-democracy, for pro-democracy or other things, human rights defenders that are at the individual level and not even like companies. So we work with a lot of people kind of in that space, whether it's Tibetans, Vietnamese activists, things like that. So there's a lot of even sharing we get sometimes from individuals that are being targeted on their personal emails and things like that. So we get a lot of visibility and telemetry and things, not just edge devices or Wi-Fi's, spear phishing or other weird SMS or WhatsApp messages and other things that they get that we get a lot of insight into.
The adversary in this space is always nation state, right?
Like for like a Wi-Fi attack like this, or I mean,
for all these edge devices, appliance things that we're seeing, and as a jump off to that question, like how bad is things in that space? What percentage of all appliance edge device attacks do you think we actually have eyes on? Is it 50%, 5%, 10%?
A couple of things. One, definitely not all nation state stuff, right? I mean, I don't keep like a running tally, but I mean, I think of things like the there's ransomware, just criminal groups that are like moving into, or aren't even moving into, they've kind of always been there, but moving more into using their resources or efforts to break into different organizations and do this like type of activity, like whatever gets them sensitive data or network access or whatever else. So there's definitely criminal actors or maybe they bought, who knows where they got the exploit from, but not believed to be specifically nation state that are doing these edge devices compromises for sure. Sorry, what in this year?
The other one was what percentage of these attacks you think we actually have visibility on? Because we're starting to see a surge in news reports about these things. It's constant, week after Juniper, Ivanti, Pulse Secure, and so on. Is this everything we know, or this is just a tiny percentage of what you think is really happening on the ground?
Yeah, so I think it's probably like a few years ago. So what's old is new, right? So for a long time ago, it used to be break into the system directly. Then it became file format exploits, right? For a long time when I was doing shadow server work and I was at NASA, oh, we got a 0-day PowerPoint, and then someone would reply back and like, oh, it didn't work, and the attacker would reply back and give a 0-day Word document, like literally the same attacker responding back to someone, like the 0 days in file formats and Adobe Flash and all that stuff. I mean, they're still being found, they still exist, but now we've kind of pivoted back to anything that kind of runs like a complicated. Some of the vulnerabilities become more complex, and others they're just simple things in complex systems. Some of these complex systems are multiple different products and things that have been all merged together. No one even knows where the source code or original developers are anymore, and they're kind of maintaining it. So like, I mean, a lot of these things that we've seen recently have been command injection vulnerabilities or like simple logic checks and things like that. You look at like some of the vulnerabilities in these products, and they're painfully easy to exploit. They're kind of like things that you're like, oh yeah, those are like, I don't know, maybe not OWASP top 10 or like these like kind of like almost like 101. And I'm not saying I would make a much worse product if I were to develop it. So it's not to harp on developers, but like some of these vulnerabilities they're not particularly complex. They didn't require like super advanced like chaining together 50 different things and understanding the intricacies of 12 loaded libraries like 8 levels deep in like the system. They were, I don't know if they were stumbled upon or how they were found exactly, but they are not the most like they're not always the most confidence inspiring things in the product. So I think there's a lot of that still to be found, and I'm not saying like, hey, it's because it's closed system, that's why. But I think, I mean, whenever there's a motivated attacker, they're gonna find a way into everything. It just turns out sometimes like the skill set or level to do that may not be as high a bar as you hope it would be in some of these like key devices. I think that's probably the recurring theme. So I think we're gonna continue to see this type of stuff. I don't know, like eyes on. I don't know what, like, even how to start a percentage. It could be like 1%. It could be 20%. I have no idea.
It's fascinating to me, and I don't mean to go on another rant, but like, you're not talking about mom and pop shops building these softwares. This is Palo Alto. These are multi-billion-dollar companies shipping these enterprise software without any sort of mitigations, anti-exploit things. It's like, it's crazy that we accept this. And one of the running themes of this podcast is, well, we accept it because there's nowhere else to go, and customers don't have other options. Like, what are you recommending to your customers?
I mean, I think looking at the vendor's response is really important, right? So we're not, I don't, you're not going to see me like cast stones at any particular vendor or anything on this.
We don't fact check. You can.
Yeah, okay, good. But I think the vendor's response is really important in a lot of this. So, I mean, you can take away and you can get I mean, it's not inappropriate. I mean, you can't fault someone. They say, oh, that was such an easy vulnerability. That's terrible. I never want to work with that vendor again in like this other one. But I don't know if alternatives to a certain line of products are any better. I don't know if anyone can definitively say that for whether that be an EDR or some kind of other web software or a firewall or a VPN appliance. But I think the vendor's response on it in terms of like, how do they communicate? How quickly do they patch it? Do they have other mitigating factors besides the patch? Like, can they implement something that does the best effort to block it while they're working on that patch? Do they cover, they get all the products covered? Did
they sign the pledge?
Yeah, I mean, TBD, like how effective the secure by design and things like that is. I mean, I don't think signing a pledge hurts, so I'll just put that out there. But if things actually become secure by design and the intended thing, it's not we won't be worse for it.
Are you an optimist that we're going to get better in a year, 2 years? Let me say we invite you back on this podcast in Thanksgiving weekend of 2020. Are we having the same conversations, or things are generally getting better?
Everything will be much worse by then. That's kidding. I have no idea. But I don't think they're all like, for every smart defense, everything they put out there, they forgot something, they missed something, or an incredibly more advanced like adversary comes along to find a way to exploit it. People get in and do supply chain stuff. I mean, we only have a handful of cases, or maybe a couple of handfuls of cases of like really advanced supply chain stuff. I mean, some of these campaigns are things that you found that were like years in the making, right? Who knows what's in a software now that we don't even know about, or we'll find out next Thanksgiving or 2 Thanksgivings from now, where we got some really even more amazing than ever's been discussed before. So I think there's a lot of possibilities. There's a lot of chance for attackers to wreak a lot of havoc. So I think the podcast will not be shut down for lack of activity.
Juanito, anything else for Steven before we jump on, try to touch the news quickly?
So why am I the one bringing this up? Have you guys had to deal with any of this Volt Typhoon bullshit, like the FOMO Typhoon stuff? It's like a recurring segment here, so I might as well, right?
Yeah, so a couple of ways. Like, the exact like what threat actor that we track it as and what Volt Typhoon will say Volt Typhoon or what else relates to. I don't know 100% in terms of different overlap or what people track as one activity versus another. Volt Typhoon, we've definitely worked in the past. It's been a little while, but we've seen them take advantage of 0 days to get in some of our defense contractor networks where they're pretty skilled in terms of how they move around. There's been a good bit of things publicized on them by law enforcement and others, security companies. Volt Typhoon, like in terms of like the main, there's a number of different publication things coming out, but like the main, from our perspective, the main activity related that people have really been focused on, I think, which Wall Street Journal, I think, kind of first came out with it, was related to major US ISPs, and even those kind of ISPs are those who provide cellular service, having their like network devices compromised. And we are working a little bit of this and aware of different components of it. And I'd say kind of put it at, I think it's obviously that's always they're huge targets. Anyone who deals with customer data, internet connectivity, cellular connectivity, SMS, text, things where people could really spy on someone or connect who's talking to who, whether that's for intel, counterterrorism, or whatever the purpose is a constant target. We've worked on plenty of cases in the last 5 years where we've seen large ISPs and data carriers compromised around the world. It's not just a US problem. That's always going to be a huge target. And what people are looking under the hood now, I don't know if everything that people are coming public with is necessarily all Volt Typhoon. I think people are really looking under the hood now more than they would before. Obviously, there's a lot of government interest in this, and there's probably there's private sector. There's a lot of people coming together to hunt, identify, and look for things in these networks that shouldn't be there, probably more so than before. What exactly is going, how they got there, I don't know. And I think that's kind of the biggest questions, right? If people are accessing and running things on a Cisco device, a Juniper device, a network device that's like core to this network, that's usually not the place the attackers started, right? They didn't, I mean, yeah, you could have a device exposed to the internet and someone broke into it. That does happen. But if someone's deep into this network infrastructure and they're backdooring it, running commands on it, modifying the setting, using certain capabilities of those devices, you have to have, there's compromise and there's a domino effect of that to get to that point. Typically, you don't start there. It could be some supply chain thing, or there could be some exposed device that I'm not aware of. But usually these speak to like kind of like larger other, compromises and breaches to get to that point. So there's a lot of places scrambling to figure that out. I don't know each one of the cases, and the ones I do, I can't talk to, but I'll tell you, we're working a lot of organizations right now that they're concerned about this. You should always be concerned about security, the possibility of this, but kind of spending more time hunting once again on devices that typically don't run EDR or have like all this, necessarily the most advanced telemetry on what's actually happening on the system. That is definitely, at least in part of the Volt Typhoon case, some of the stuff that's being taken advantage of, and is a little bit of maybe a large part, but it's part of the problem too. So
you are working on some of these intrusions. Are you to blame for T-Mobile saying these attacks were successfully blocked? And in a serious note, when T-Mobile puts out a statement on Volt Typhoon and says the company clarified that it detected recent intrusion attempts, but these attacks were successfully blocked, like is that a believable statement? Like how can you know for sure that you've blocked this thing?
Yeah, I have to take anything that someone puts at face value. Obviously there are always questions, right? And it's right for that. Hey, okay, so they're probably releasing all they can. You'd want to know that, like, what, how were they connected to it? What were the commands? What did they log in with? What was the system that they connected through? Kind of like, go back to the things I was just mentioning. To get to a certain point, usually there's other things that happen. Those are like natural questions to ask. So I don't have any reason to doubt T-Mobile. I don't know the specifics. I don't want to like speculate per se. That's probably not in my best interest. But, think of the questions that you're wondering about. And those are probably good things. Doesn't hurt in wondering or asking. So
you got a few minutes to stick around. We're going to touch on the news a little bit.
Yeah. I should be. No one's pounding on my door. We're good. I think we're fine.
If the kids don't start banging, that can run off though.
One of the fascinating stories that popped up this week is ESET pushing out an analysis of this Firefox Tor browser 0 day, apparently used by Russian cybercriminal groups with this rom-com backdoor. Costin, you've been tracking this. Like, who's behind this? Is this a nation-state thing? Is this a law enforcement operation?
Man, this is like a very interesting case, and think that maybe more companies should probably cover this particular group. And what I was thinking here, I think if you remember that initially when we were wondering who might be behind this, we were all saying like FBI, like some counterterrorism related operation. It turns out it was actually Russian cyber criminals. So just like another proof of how wrong this random attribution can be. But now it's really interesting that the exploitation for Tor browser, this is not something that you see a lot. And why might you target Tor browser users unless you are maybe concerned with people leveraging things like dark markets to buy maybe drugs, to trade all sorts of illegal materials. If you ask me, I have seen this kind of targeting before with Russia. It was the case of Cosmic Duke. So that was malware that was used at the same time by different Russian intelligence organizations. It was used by the FSB, by the SVR, and at the same time by FSKN, which was the drug enforcement agency in Russia. So I'm wondering if maybe this is one of those cases again where this is a kind of it's a shared backdoor used by multiple threat actors, and what we're seeing here is that there's multiple different entities leveraging this 0 day to target different categories of users, be it diplomatic users on one hand, but also maybe people trying to buy steroids, drugs, and things like that.
Interesting. Firefox, it was Firefox all day on Windows targeting Tor users. At the same time, I saw Tor putting out a note asking for more bridges to help with some Russian censorship issues there. Security research, is that a space you're tracking very, very closely? Censorship, Tor? Costin, help me understand if this news is registering in your world at all.
Well, of course, in Russia, there's a massive censorship of all sorts of different internet services. Facebook is labeled as a terrorist organization. So a lot of things are blocked. People do try to use VPNs. Some of them, they do try to use Tor. And at the same time, the government, in particular, the organization known as Roskomnadzor, they're trying to stop people from getting access to news, getting access to free information, again, censoring pretty much everything. We've seen, by the way, in the past, we've seen also cases when malicious Tor exit nodes were trying to inject themselves Onion Duke, the malware Onion Duke in downloads. And some people speculated it may have been related to Russian government tenders for ways to bypass Tor. So yeah, if you ask me, this has been a hot topic for several years in Russia, and they've been trying to bypass Tor and find ways to de-anonymize people using Tor browser. But again, it's been mostly related to government efforts, not necessarily cyber criminals.
All right, Juanito, any thoughts here? Steve, you can jump in and...
Yeah, I can go ahead, Juan.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, this rom-com group in particular is sort of interesting, right? Like, that's one we've seen that started purely as, well, considered purely cyber criminal. Then we're not entirely certain they seem to be doing work for the gov. Like, one thing I will say as we talk about some of these O-days and wondering whether it's part of a tender, wondering how they're getting their hands on it. I mean, part of the difficulty here that we don't love to acknowledge is the true wealth of resources on the cybercrime side of things is considerable, right? Like the notion that these folks are sitting on quite this much, even just in cryptocurrency, that they may not be able to launder, may not be able to leverage right away, and that they wouldn't use that to buy O-days it's always felt wrong, right? Like at some point you have to reinvest your proceeds into your business. These people think of it as a proper business. Like you're telling me that they wouldn't take out of the, thousands of Bitcoin you're sitting on, you wouldn't take some of that, throw someone a bone and say, hey, give me an O-day for whatever, right? Like I think for a long time it spoke to how easy a time ransomware groups were having with opportunistic infections. But at some point, you do have to wonder when you look at, let's say, Clop, where it's like, hey, however the hell it is they figured out this move it exploit, it basically gave them so much runway of victims that they have been processing them for like a year and a half or something like that. Like you still have data being leaked out from move it based infections. To what extent isn't it worth it for them, right?
And Steve, this is where you talked about this professionalization of ransomware. It's not always nation states in this space. Are you running into a lot of cyber criminals? Are you surprised by the quality of tools, TTPs, ODAs, access to things that cyber criminals now have? And do you believe there's kind of like a merging those two groups in some ways?
Yeah, it's a couple. I mean, yeah, and some of the groups you get on there, and it's some is amateur hour, and some are super advanced in how they move and operate. So like the rom-com stuff, yeah, they kind of like piggyback on what Juan said. Whether they're buying it, I mean, yeah, who knows? Maybe they hired somebody that works full time and they try and come up with different exploits. Our that Intel team, the Microsoft Word 0-day they came across was the rom-com guys. They're kind of a like very specific versions, if I believe, and kind of like had to be certain scenarios of the products and setup that you're running. But that was through them. We don't know where they got that. Now we have the Firefox and kind of 0-day and the privilege escalation in Windows. So I'd say the main thing I wanted to mention and take away from this is one, ESET's been doing an awesome job on a lot of their research. That's been great. But two, if you look at the timeline, if I remember correctly, I don't remember the exact dates, but I think the timeline is like they reported it to Mozilla and then like the patch was released the next day. So like kind of one of my big takeaways on this is like kind of independent from the threat actor where they got the exploit, but it's kind of some of these. Occasionally you get these like amazing turnaround times where like there's a vulnerability discovered, found, figured out, and then a patch is released almost instantly. And yeah, I think even in the Microsoft one, if I read that correctly, I think this patch Tuesday from something they got in October, which is for non in the wild RCE type thing, is like a really fast turnaround too. So I'd like not to just like everyone gets a pat on the back, but I am impressed with the kind of the research, the reporting, and then the turnaround time in how quickly this stuff got fixed. Because think about how short-lived. I mean, yeah, I think there's some dates in there, but maybe they've been exploiting this for I don't know. The feature got introduced 3 months ago, but like they've been exploiting it for years. But some of this stuff, maybe they've been exploiting it for like a week, and it gets like killed off instantly. I mean, that's like the return on investment potentially for some of these like exploits and vulnerabilities could be really short based on some of the discoveries and turnaround time and patching, which I'd say is a kind of an impressive metric.
It's only impressive until the patches start breaking, though. I mean, that's the worry with some of these rushing out these patches and having patch quality issues, which turn out to be worse than sometimes the
yeah, I mean, sometimes
patches.
the patch doesn't actually fix it. Or it could crash or introduce a new problem. So I mean,
yeah,
I can't speak too much to that, especially in this case. So I don't really know for sure, but in general, though, I applaud the effort. Even I'm not aware of it not working. If it doesn't work, I at least applaud the effort. If it works, then it's like really awesome. So.
And nice shout out to ESET, because we'll pivot to not a quick story with ESET, but I have a little bit of a scoop on this one. Costin, I think you're aware of this. ESET published a post on a prototype.
But by the way, we're not allowed to give the attribution information.
No attribution. Sources say, but ESET found this Linux bootkit prototype.
By the way, Steve, like I don't know what they're doing either. So like these motherfuckers are sitting on some proprietary information here, and we'll both be lost together.
Yeah, I'm waiting to see.
No wait, yesterday the big story came out that ESET had found the first ever UEFI bootkit for Linux, uploaded to VirusTotal in November 2024, and they went through describing this bootkitty thing. Our friends at Binarly did some follow-up research and figured out that this was actually tied to LogoFAIL. LogoFAIL, the vulnerabilities they reported over a year ago, was part of the setup for getting this bootkit kind of past secure boot. Turns out, we found out just today, sources say this is actually a university project out of South Korea. We can confirm that it's a project from the Korean education program called BOB. And BOB refers to the best of the best, which trains the next generation of cybersecurity leaders. Participants are students who create projects are part of this curriculum, and apparently this bootkit with the LogoFAIL exploitation, uploading to VirusTotal and sending everyone off and with their hair on fire is actually a university project. Costin, what was your first reaction? Because I know you were looking at the bootkit code yesterday to find this out today. Is there any sort of like weirdness here?
Well, first of all, can you say who was the source, like where you got the information about that?
The level of confidence was 100%. I can say that.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. I'm not surprised in the sense that there were a lot of Korean names in the malware. I think ESET just decided to censor all those names, but you can actually see the names of the authors in there. And with the simple Googling for some of those names, you might end up in certain places where those
It
guys
became
are
much more
just
obvious.
students.
Is this Onion Duke Part 2?
No, it wasn't Onion Dog, right? Not Onion Duke.
Onion Dog.
Dog.
That's the one I'm thinking about.
What is
yeah.
Onion Dog? You see what I put up with, Steven? They're
Yeah.
going to
Yeah,
their codename
it doesn't
bullshit.
feel nice, right? It's not nice, is it?
Onion Dog.
Costin, you want to tell the story of Onion Dog? Like,
Sure. Like we discovered something which was quite interesting, a malware. We ended up calling Onion Dog. And what was interesting here, there was always a new version of that at a certain time of the year. So you could almost be sure that come September, there'll be a new version of Onion Dog getting deployed like massively. And we kept investigating over and over until we discovered that this was actually a pen test. It was like a national pen test that was happening in South Korea around that time every single year. So they just had a new version of the malware. So if you want, this story teaches us a couple of lessons that you may have national pen tests, you may see things that you think they're malware, but they're just releasing it in a very controlled manner, and pretty much all the time someone uploads it to VirusTotal and it leaks back to you. Which may be also the case with this bootkit. It may also be leaked in some way to VirusTotal.
Juan, is this something you guys frown upon? You straddle academia a little bit here. Is this something you frown upon?
what am I going to frown upon, man? I mean, at least it's not, ransomware for quote unquote educational purposes, or it's not these red teaming frameworks that just. It's like, look at the cool thing I can do. Now let me enable everybody on Earth. It is kind of the same thing. I guess what I should be saying, let me treat this differently. It's not that I do or don't frown upon it. At this point, it's like an embarrassment of riches of how much terrible shit is out there. I don't love it that folks are kind of so willing to enable others on the outside. But at the same time, I think getting mad at folks that are putting out offensive tooling, which in this case isn't the case, right? Like they just, it's just a sample that's popped off. It's not like they're, hey, here's the source code for a root
Creation of malware, though, right? Isn't it creation of malware?
Yeah, sure. And God knows what they're doing it for. But it's not like the creation of malware in and of itself is the greatest sin here. At the end of the day, if actually keeps moving the needle towards people taking firmware as a more serious space to take care of, then I'll take it as a net positive. And I can say that, like, look, you want to be critical of the EDR space. I as much as I'm coming from an EDR company,
Don't get fired.
I kept my mouth shut about the lies and bullshit of like the one telco that's able to like stop Volt Typhoon while none others can, even though they can't seem to stop a bunch of like 13-year-olds. But
let's pick on T-Mobile time.
No. Let's go into the firmware part. Look, I think there's this self-feeding cycle that comes with things like memory resident malware and firmware resident malware and maybe GPU resident malware and whatever you want, where you get into this PM-led cycle of prioritization where you go, hey, this is a serious issue. We don't have great visibility into memory, into firmware, into a GPU, into whatever. And they go, well, how many threats are really out there? And you go, well, we can't possibly know because we don't have great visibility. You go, well, that doesn't sound like a priority. Then a threat pops off and you go, look, somebody else figured out, right? Steve figured out this thing that's only in memory. Binarly figured out this thing that's only in firmware. They go, oh, that's cool. But how many of them are really out there? Is this affecting our customers? Do any of our customers want firmware inspectability? You go, well, they don't know that this is a problem. You go, well, that's not really a priority, right? Like, I do think that there are these specific areas. Like the reason I was fawning over Volexity, the same way that I fawn over Binarly, is that you have these specific areas that a lot of companies don't want to tackle because they're hard tech problems, because they're difficult, not because they're not fruitful, not because they're not blind spots, but because they're difficult. And that's precisely where you start to see things like this, where you go, look, this one university project is able to kind of flaunt past a lot of the protections that we're concerned with. What do we do? Right? And it's not an easy area to go into, but it is an area we have to go into at some point. And I'm not going to be upset at people making malware for these parts as much as I want to say, look, if that's possible, then for us, the responsibility is how do we ensure inspectability into those areas, not how do we keep students from writing malware.
Steve,
Yeah.
is this, you view this as a net positive? You think this is a positive benefit, or do you expect this gets folded into live malware attacks at some point?
No, I definitely a net positive in my opinion. Raising awareness or people doing research and pushing the bar is, I think, most cases almost always a good thing. And the conversation on, did they release it with a bunch of flags that can be used to do stuff that's clearly malicious for research purposes? You can argue whether or not that's like good or bad. I mean, that's something someone could do natively. They could always, it's just, are you making an easy button for someone to do really nefarious stuff versus are you proving something's possible? Are you trying it out? Are you finding weaknesses? I mean, I don't know exactly what their intent or they're doing or this is the Onion Dog and they've been releasing a version of this every year and this is just the first time it got uploaded to Virus Total, or did you guys just mess up their presentation at a conference like next week or something like that? I don't know the answer to that, but I think raising awareness or finding, I mean, it's cool to see people pushing them, finding new ways to do stuff. And it's notable for a reason, right? That's why we're talking about it right now. I know our team they try to keep on different things like that. I think a lot of, from talking to team over the years now, I think a lot of times we find it on Windows, it's for like cheating in video games. Like they want to circumvent anti-cheat stuff. And it's not even, you could say that's malicious, but it's not even like malware or nation state or threat actor. I kind of put it akin to almost like some of the jailbreak kind of community. And so they find a purpose, they want to get around something and they're innovative and they're not malicious. But then you think about an attacker could use that or attacker could already be doing that and you're not even looking for it. You don't know how to look for it. It's like, that's why we like having certain access or ability to inspect things, right? If someone's operating here and you're saying, I only want you to operate here, you can never find that. I mean, you could get to a point where the threat actor exposes their exploit on the internet or they do something and you're like, well, how is that even possible? And you're asking a question which has no answer, like obvious answer. And you're like, well, they must be higher than I can look. I mean, you can sometimes figure that out, but if you could be looking at that space or taking a deeper dive at things or kind of inspecting it at a higher level or know to even do that, it's really important. But I mean, the business, Juan kind of touched on the business case, right? Like if I need to hire 50 people and spend millions of dollars just to do this one thing that like someone did a research on, a research project on, it's not to say you shouldn't do it or like the most important hack in the world that you never detected could have come from it. That's always going to be a problem, proving why someone should spend the time to do this when they have all these other problems they need to solve. I mean, I think unless it becomes mainstream or there becomes an easy button to do it, that's going to be a challenge. But I think to answer your question, net positive, I think so.
I mean, on the firmware side, the reason this matters much more than we're letting on to is, well, I say firmware. Really, this is a bootkit, right? Like any of these where what you're talking about is something that underpins the root of trust is where you get unseated from, right? Like Steve said earlier, you go, well, you don't want the attackers to be able to jump straight into and basically be invisible to you, right? Like that's the rootkit issue of the late 90s, early 2000s before driver signing enforcement. And then now that Microsoft broke all the code signing for no reason, the whole point of it was if this thing has greater altitude than your kernel driver in some way, or it starts before you get your product seated, then it can unseat you or it can blind you. And at the end of the day, with firmware, with bootkits, the issue is it underpins everything. So, this is one of those areas where the real issue is that the vulnerability has not been used in such a loud way as to really make it a top of mind discussion for the boardroom. But the day somebody designs like bootkit ransomware that just bypasses everything, then we're all going to suddenly have a very stark discussion about why, bootkits and rootkits matter so much and why firmware matters so much. You go, well, I didn't want us to wait for that day, but if that's what drives the investment cycle, like that's what's missing. It's like customers are not asking for this. You go, yeah, customers don't know any better, but we also haven't told them why they should.
And then you give me a whole new cycle's a question about why doesn't EDR vendors do this? Like, why am I not relying on my EDR vendor to do this? Costin, close the loop on this story. As a threat hunter, is there anything in that virus total update, anything in the research public that you can use to set traps to look for signs of this thing popping up in malicious activity?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that you can pivot on if you want. What I was thinking here is that maybe the most obvious thing to me is that there's a huge gap between the research that we see and the kind of things that hit the internet and what is actually happening in the wild out there. So I just remember that was a couple of years ago that I was looking at a number of CVs, and what attracted my attention was someone who claimed that they were developing system management mode rootkits, SSM rootkits for different brands of servers. We were talking about malware running in hypervisor mode, so in so-called negative rings. So it feels that, these kind of school projects that eventually hit the news, they are just a couple of years kind of behind what is really happening in the wild. And in reality, we have no clue what is happening with system management mode rootkits, with hypervisor rootkits, and those of things. So when a system management mode rootkit runs on your machine, basically it's undetectable because you can't dump the SMM memory. You can't maybe reflash the firmware because the rootkit blocks the reflashing of the firmware. So it's like that's the kind of things that keep me awake at night. But it's always kind of a gap of a couple of years, and we are behind what is happening out there. That's my opinion.
So shout out to the Koreans for raising our awareness and advancing the art, right?
Bit.
A little bit.
All right, we're going to have to let Steven Adair go. So we'll close right now with some shout outs. From my side, I'll start. Congratulations to our friend Chris Bing, former Reuters journalist who is joining ProPublica. ProPublica is an amazing publication that just gave us this Microsoft story about Microsoft and their lock-in with the US government. That's the quality of reporting we see coming from there. Chris Bing joins that team, a journalist we respect, so best of luck to Chris. Costin, anything from you?
Shout outs to my former colleagues, Dan and Georgi, who are presenters at DevCamp. Georgi presented on APT 31, a very cool talk, maybe one of the best talks at the conference, if you ask me. And Dan, who presented on GPS attacks.
Awesome. Steven, any shout outs? Anything you see out there that you can give a little pep talk to?
I was going to do a quick, shout out to you guys. Thanks for letting me come on the 3-buddy problem, maybe temporary a 4-buddy problem. So I appreciate your guys' hard work. We'll get a couple, maybe 2 or 3 more listeners after this one. I can only hope. Or if it goes down, then I'm so sorry. And otherwise, just in general, shout out to, whole Volexity team, whether it's on our services intel side, our internal staff, or the product development. I think they all do an outstanding job. I think I try to say it all the time, but I'll say it publicly here on this podcast, just to, if there were any doubters, they know I'm big fans of our team, number 1 fans. So,
shout out to Paul, Andrew, and our friends over at Volexity. I mean, we respect those guys. Juanito, shout outs from you?
No particular shout outs in mind right now, but I will say very eager to see what's going on in the Middle East sort of popping off again, right? We have a potential ceasefire on one end, a Syrian overrun on the other. These are the sorts of things that make for very interesting stories and very interesting localized hunting. So sharpen your Yara rules and let's see what pops off.
Quickly, LabsCon, the first keynote from LabsCon is now posted on YouTube. Dr. Cristina Cifuentes, a talk on decompilation, that's available. And then lastly, again, PivotCon call for papers is open. Pivotcon.org, check it out. That's a LabsCon kind of sister event that happens in Europe. And that's it for the show. Steven, appreciate the time, appreciate you coming on, sharing your expertise. This has been an amazing experience for us. It's now the 4 bodies, so appreciate that.
Thanks, guys. Thanks so much.
And with that, thank you, guys. We'll catch you again next week.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.